resolution. We'll be defining the resolution as a true fact, and that is the job of the government team to uphold this as a true fact. But now let's look at some definitions. The first of which is this house you can define as teenagers. Again, teenagers. The second definition is that of can't even. They can't cope after a breakup. Teenagers cannot cope after a breakup. That is how we as the government team have defined the resolution today. And I'd like to go through some contentions really talking about why teenagers cannot cope with life after a breakup. So my first contention you can tag as hormones. Now, teenagers are the most mentally unstable people other than those held in an insane asylum. Teenagers' moods go back and forth and they fluctuate all of the time. Now, I personally know a lot of teenagers, as I am one, and I know that teenagers can be very crazy. I especially know that once teenagers break up after they end a relationship, that their moods swing back and forth all the time. Sometimes my friend wants to go play football, and other times he just wants to sit and cry on his couch. That's how teenagers are after a breakup, is their moods swing back and forth because of hormones. But the second contention you can tag as outside pressures. Again, outside pressures. Subpoint A you can tag as school. Now, in society nowadays, it's a very big thing to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, to be in a relationship. That's something that there's a lot of pressure on. Many people feel pressure to be in a relationship as they feel that society will accept them more if they have someone affirming how good of a person they are. This is especially prevalent in schools where many people are in relationships because they feel that they will be more accepted if they have another person affirming how good of a person they are. Subpoint B is that of friendships. Again, friendships. Now, I know of many people who have friends that pressure them a lot to go into a relationship. They pressure them to get a girlfriend or to get a boyfriend. And yes, I'll take your question.
All right, you would agree the resolution is a definite statement, meaning it can't happen, correct?
Yes, I would. But let's go down to the third contention, which is that of culture. Now, culture nowadays is very focused on teenagers being in relationships. We're going to look at some songs, movies, and celebrities that all say that teenagers should not be single when they are a teenager, and that's really the prevalent view in society today. Subpoint A is that of songs. Again, songs. There are many songs out there that say that teenagers cannot cope after being in a breakup, that it breaks their heart, and that they want to go do all kinds of terrible things after they're in a breakup. There are all kinds of songs that talk about the importance of love for young people. Like I said in the beginning, the Beatles said very famously in their song "All You Need Is Love." Ed Sheeran wrote the song "Shape of You," and then there's songs such as "Thinking Out Loud." Literally every single Justin Bieber song. All of these songs focus on love for young people and how important society sees love as being for young people. But now let's go to movies. Movies are very much talk about love for young people. Also, TV shows talk about love for young people. If you watch a lot of popular TV shows nowadays, if there are teenagers, they are most likely in a relationship with someone else. That is something that's very prevalent in society today. Subpoint C is that of celebrities. Now, celebrities move back and forth from relationship to relationship all the time. Celebrities, many people look up to celebrities as being these perfect people, and they see these people as breaking up all the time and then just being able to go and get into a new relationship and being in a relationship all the time. And so teenagers feel that if they aren't currently in a relationship, that they don't live up to the standard that all of these famous people that they see around them live up to. But this brings us to our final contention, which you can tag as feeling of security. Again, feeling of security. Now, when someone is in a relationship, having someone by their side who sides with them and who says, "I affirm you as a person, I believe that you are a good person, so I will stick with you through thick and through thin," that is something that people find a lot of security in. They say, well, now I have a girlfriend, my girlfriend will stick with me no matter what. But it doesn't actually end up working that way. And really, when like we talked about in the very beginning, when teenagers go through a breakup, they simply can't cope with life. They can't cope with all of the emotions that they feel, all of the pressure that they feel. And really what we should be discussing back and forth today in the debate round is the fact that when a teenager goes through a breakup in a relationship, that they simply become a completely different person. They simply cannot cope with the pressures and all of the different outside forces that are pushing them around, saying, you need to be this perfect person that society says that you should be shaped to. And really, when we look at the resolution today, that this House literally can't even, we should be siding with the government team in saying that teenagers after a breakup literally cannot cope with life. Thank you.
When I was 6 years old, I was seriously boy crazy. I would keep lists in my journal of all the random boys I'd see around town, and I'd write them down. I have a list. One says boy at Costco, boy on the TV screen in the movie theater. I had a problem, but as I grew up, that problem decreased. As a teenager, I have experienced some relationships, but I haven't had a problem coping with the breakup factor about it. And that's really what I'm going to be proving today, is that all teens cannot be defined by what the government team says. That they're taking this all-encompassing approach, however, it's absolutely not able to be proven in today's debate round. First, let's start out with their definition of literally can't even. They said that teens can't cope after a breakup. I'd like to remind all of this that we're talking about breakups here because a lot of their contentions didn't really apply to breakups. But I respond to their definition of literally can't even, that teens can't cope with breakups, with 3 responses, 3 burdens for the government team. The first burden you can tag as must prove in all cases. Again, must prove in all cases. What this resolution says today is not some of the House can't even, but that this House, all of the House, literally can't even. Now, the government team has decided to define this as teens. Therefore, they must prove that all teens, in all cases, literally can't even. I would remind you that this is a reasonable burden because they have chosen to define it as teens. They could have defined it as anything else that would have not put this burden on them, but they have chosen teens and breakups. Therefore, in all cases, they must prove this. My second response you can tag as must prove no one can cope. Again, must prove no one can cope. This is essentially the same idea, just a different way of stating it. I'll be talking about how I'm an example why the resolution isn't true and that there's no way, no teenager can cope after a breakup. My third burden you can tag as opposition need only show one instance. Again, opposition need only show one instance. As the opposition team, we need only show you one instance in where a teenager we know or a teenager we've heard about has been able to cope. Because if that instance is true, it brings down the entire resolution. Let's start out with their contention 1. They talk about how teens are mentally unstable and that they can't cope after breakups. My response you can tag as breakups are sometimes mutual. Again, breakups are sometimes mutual. Just because teens are mentally unstable doesn't mean that after every breakup they won't be able to cope. Oftentimes, 2 people say, we agree we are just not right for each other. And they say, you know what, maybe it'd be better if we went our separate ways, and they leave on good terms. Sometimes people want to break up, and that actually makes them more stable as a person because they're not tied in a relationship that they don't want to be. People get together, they realize they're not good for each other, and that actually makes them less mentally stable because they're stressing about how to make it work. And when they break up, they're more mentally stable because they're at places in their lives where they want to be. But their second contention was of outside pressures. They talked about how school and friendships, all these things pressure us to get boyfriends and girlfriends. My response you can tag as doesn't prove their interpretation true. Again, doesn't prove their interpretation true. Just because our culture is very adamant about boys and girls getting boyfriends and girlfriends doesn't mean that somehow the resolution is now proven true, that absolutely no teen can cope after a breakup. Unfortunately, all the contentions that they brought up in their speech didn't prove what they claimed. They just gave examples of how society pushes us to have boyfriends and girlfriends, but they gave no examples of how absolutely no teen can cope after a breakup. Going down to contention 3, they talked about our culture and how our culture's worldview is really pushing this idea of sadness after a breakup, and JB sings about crying when his girl leaves and it's all sad. We want to get our tissues out and eat chocolate. But all the examples they brought up of songs and TV shows and celebrities all have one response to this contention. And again, none prove that no teen can cope. Again, none prove that no teen can cope. This doesn't provide proof that absolutely no teen can cope just because there are songs about how someone is sad when someone broke up with them. In fact, there are many songs that say, yes, I'm free from this relationship. I no longer have to submit to your binding ways. And we hear those songs like Beyonce of freedom from a relationship. I can find another just like you. There's that song. And it proves that just because some songs talk about being sad after a breakup doesn't mean that all people experience that. Their contention 4 was a feeling of security, that people are in relationships because they want to feel secure and that makes them mentally stable. My response you can tag as more security, often after breakups. Again, more security, often after breakups. I talked about that earlier, but sometimes in abusive relationships, even teens can have abusive relationships, a person feels more secure after they've broken up with that person because they don't feel in danger anymore. Now I'm going to bring up some opposite contentions, or opposition contentions, some off-case contentions. Contention 1 you can tag as part-to-whole fallacy. Part-to-whole fallacy. Now this is a logical fallacy stating that because something sometimes happens, therefore it's always true. The government team is assuming because sometimes teens can't cope with breakups, then therefore all teens literally can't even cope with breakups. And that's just a huge statement to make, and that is ultimately unsupported. It's not true for all people. I'm an example of that person who got together with someone, realized that some of their qualities really weren't what I was looking for, that they didn't share my worldview, that they weren't as strong in their faith as I was, and I felt better after breaking up with them than I did when I was with them. Contention 2 you can tag as influence versus reality. Influence versus reality. Just because songs and celebrities and TV shows influence the way that we think about breakups, I mean, when we hear that word, it sounds sad. It's kind of a negative word. You're breaking something up, but that doesn't mean that's the reality. And at the end of the day, the government team has decided to define it in this way. They've decided to be all-encompassing, to talk about teens and breakups, and it's a fun topic. I'm glad that we're talking about this instead of something really dry, but they have put this burden on themselves, and I believe that I've shown you that they won't be able to uphold that burden, which is why I would urge you to vote for the opposition team. Thank you.
I made lists and lists of all my favorite Legos. I was actually a big Lego fan. I didn't really notice girls. I didn't even know what they were. They were just kind of like, they were like, oh, it's my sister and her friends. Hi, and that was it. But I think that's besides the point. But I think when you go older, and then when you realize when you turn into a teenager, your body starts going through changes. You start noticing people, and you start realizing that society has a big influence on teenagers. Teenagers are very unstable people. They can be influenced by a lot of things, especially by music, especially by just the people that are around, just other teenagers. And as we all know, the blind leading the blind never ends well. If we have an unstable teenager who is going off of some breakup and trying to influence her friend who's also another teenager, that never ends well. But the point of the matter is that talking about how teenagers can be easily exposed and they can easily be taken advantage of, especially when we're talking about relationships. Now they put a lot of their trust and their security, and they try to find their identity in their relationship. And when that relationship breaks up, when they're a victim of that breakup, then we find that they cannot cope with that. Immediately after that relationship, they cannot cope with that sudden loss of security, with that sudden loss of comfort and love that they used to have with a relationship. But first, let's respond to the burdens brought up by the opposition team. She had 3 burdens. I'm going to have 2 responses. My first response is immediately after. We're only talking about immediately after a breakup. We're not saying that permanently they will forever not be able to cope. We're talking about immediately after a breakup. For example, my cousin used to date a really nice dude. He was this tall, really good-looking dude, and then she broke up with him, and of course, I'm a boy, so I really didn't know that she broke up with him. I was oblivious. But the point of the matter is that once we saw that she breaking up with him, we had dinner, and my extended family came over, my cousin came over, but she was completely downcast. We almost thought she was sick by the way she was acting. She had her glasses on, she usually wears contacts, she has no makeup, she's wearing these clothes that are generally considered, not to be nice clothes, like bum clothes if you're just hanging out at home, and crying. She had spent a lot of time not trying to cope, but really not immediately after a breakup. She couldn't cope with the fact that actually that boyfriend, that she actually was a victim of the breakup. That's my second response, is a victim of the breakup. We're talking about teenagers who have been the victim of the breakup, not teenagers who were the engager, who were the people who actually did the breakup. We're talking about people who were the victims of a breakup. So let's go down and let's respond to the responses to the contention. Starting off with contention number 1 of the government team, talking about hormones. Now she said breakups are mutual, that some breakups are mutual. Again, we're talking only about victims of breakups. We're talking about a person who would have wanted to stay in this relationship for longer, suddenly being out of this relationship, suddenly being removed from this relationship. But first, we'll take a question.
Did you guys state that in your first speech, or did you just say teenagers can't cope?
We did only say teenagers after a breakup. But let's go down to the second contention. Actually, let me explain this contention number one more. And really, the point of this contention was not to say that the teenagers after it was just really point to the fact that teenagers can be very sensitive and very unstable people who would put a lot of their trust and their stability into a breakup, and the loss of that sudden person in their life can do a lot, causing them to not be able to cope. Talking about contention number two, about the outside pressure, talking about school and friendship, talking about how really a lot of people in school, there's a lot of pressure in school, which can really stress out a teenager and causing them to be even more unstable, to look for more of a security and stability and a safeguard in that relationship. And once they're in that relationship, that's what they hold on to. That's how they stay alive under the pressures of schools and friendship. The response here is that it doesn't really prove the interpretation true. My response, again, is how it applies pressure. That's mainly the point of this contention. How it applies pressure on the teenager. Our teenagers face a lot of pressure from not only from their own bodies and how their body is being changed and how they're growing in just different ways, becoming an adult from a child, but also they're in that weird transition stage where they're not a child, so they do have responsibilities, but they're not an adult, so they can't exactly cope with all those responsibilities because they don't have the experience, they don't have the income, they don't have just the simple the things that adults have that teenagers don't have. So that's why the teenagers are in a weird transition stage. They don't know exactly what they want to do in life yet, which makes them even more unstable, not knowing what exactly they're going to be doing with the rest of life, causing them to essentially put more faith into the relationships. Let's go down to the third point on this, talking about the culture, talking about songs, movies, and celebrities. And she basically said how, well, none of these proves that no teen can cope. My response here is out of a relationship equals out of place. Out of a relationship equals out of place. A lot of teenagers are influenced by society, and a lot of teenagers are influenced by popular culture of what exactly is happening in the culture, and what is happening in Hollywood, is happening in our movies, which is happening in our artists and our celebrities. So if the artists and the celebrities and the popular culture of the United States as a whole is pushing this picture that once you break up with someone, well, first off, find someone that you love. And once you break up with someone, that is a terrible experience. These teenagers are being influenced, whether they know it or not, by those messages that is being pushed by. That's why we see so many love songs that are currently happening that are so popular. Almost every single let's say, top 50 song is almost a love song. Yes, your question.
What about Beyonce who says, "You must not know about me, I could find another you in a minute"?
I could say that's a second stage of it. First, it's talking about how you're really sad. Then second is kind of like that sour grapes kind of feel, like, oh, I'm really sad, but you weren't even good for me anyway, so I'm gonna go find another man. Something like that. That would be the second stage, talking about how they really can't cope, so they try to like essentially close off and be more antagonistic to their breakup versus being just straight up in tears, not knowing what's going to happen, eating chocolate, watching movies, eating ice cream. That's exactly what's going to be happening. That's why we see it so common in a popular culture, really showing you how the amount of a relationship, the amount of influence and the amount of stability and power that a relationship gives to a teenage life is immense, especially when that teenager really relies on her significant other or his significant other. And when that relationship is suddenly gone, when it's suddenly removed from the equation, that can really affect the teenager. That can really destabilize the teenager, can really shake the teenager to see whether or not what exactly is going on, what did I do wrong, why is he or she not like me anymore. And because of that, we believe that teenagers can't actually cope after breakups. First off, because of the pressures that we have here, the hormones, the outside pressure, the culture that is all talking about how you shouldn't be coping, and because of that, all that pressure, that makes the teenager not being able to cope with these normal pressures once they realize that the source of stability is being gone. So that's really going to be the main point here, is that these teens are heavily influenced, and they're being heavily pressurized. They're essentially being stressed out, as that song from 21 Pilots talks about, how we're really stressed out, we don't know what to do, and because of that, they try to find the security in relationships, but when those relationships are gone, they all go crazy.
Alright, since we're sticking with the themes of where we were when we were 6 years old, this is probably going to change how you view me, but I went to kindergarten and all of the girls chased me around in a game that I thought was tag, and all of the parents hated it. And I had no clue until recently when my mom was talking. You remember in kindergarten when that happened? And now I'm completely embarrassed of what was actually happening. But it just explains how clueless we are. Then fun story, it doesn't really relate to the round. And I never actually thought that I would come to Monterey to debate about breaking up. But let's go down and deal with the argumentation, starting with the idea of they can't, the burdens. And he said immediately afterwards, and the victim of the breakup. Starting with immediately afterwards, I have two responses to this, and that is of in all cases. in all cases. This is basically what we're saying with this resolution, is it limits them to in all cases this must be true, because it says it literally can't even. Just basically in all cases, no one can cope. The second response is no one can cope. Just to clarify this just a step further, is if we can prove for you that someone can cope, or that teenagers can cope, or some teenagers could cope with a breakup, even if they are a victim, ultimately the ballot should be to the opposition team. Let's now go down to the second point of the victim of the breakup. I have two responses to this. My first is they didn't specify. They didn't specify. I think this is going to become a crucial point, because they're now narrowing down the round even further, which is not what was under the resolutional analysis, because they said teenagers and can't cope after a breakup. So the resolution as they defined it would read, teenagers literally can't even cope after a breakup. And so this is how it was defined from the first speech, and why we should hold to this based on their very definitions of this. It wasn't teenagers who were the victim, or wasn't specific to that. It's specifically teenagers literally can't even cope with a breakup. So let's now go down and deal with what he had to say across from contention 1, where he said victims, and he talked about how it's not talking about these mutual instances. I have two responses to this. My first is the idea of both. In this round, we're considering both teenagers, both the person who breaks up, which is going to become a contention to talk about how not all teenagers can't cope with it in and of itself, but my second response is not true in all instances. I can give you an example of this. This summer, actually, I was interested in a girl. We talked about dating, almost did, but then I called it off because it was actually not a very beneficial situation. Lack of details, not going to throw it all in there, but ultimately we broke up. Didn't really affect either of us that much. So what it came down to is we both were able to cope. We move on. I'm actually still friends with the girl, and we just decided we're both going to be friends. I was the one that called it off. She was the victim. I proved one instance. Now, the reason why this matters is, it again goes back to this burden of they have to prove it all the time. If we can prove to you one instance in where this happens and which it's not true, you should decide with the opposition team, and I'll take your question.
Don't want to hate on your love life, but were you guys actually dating, or was it just like interest?
Pretty much. I don't want to get into specifics on it for you guys, but pretty much it was dating.
Oh, okay.
Woo, got that out of the way. Let's go. Contention 2. Talking about applies pressure. I have two responses to this. My first response is a link, not proof. A link, not proof. Basically, the idea of this is, in this round, the affirmative government team is supposed to be providing contentions for why teenagers can't cope. What we are saying across from this, not cope. So my second response is prove coping ability. The ability of these teenagers to cope would be go to the step beyond what these influences are and what the pressures are. The step beyond it as this pressures them, and thus it happens. Thus, this is actually happening. That's why this really doesn't apply to the round and doesn't prove the resolution true. It's because it's only the link, but they don't prove the impact of it when that it actually is stopping people. While it arguably could also affect media, and these outside pressures could affect people to not break up. One example, to break up for good instances. An example of this, I played baseball with a guy for 8 years. He actually had a girlfriend for 2 years, and the school pressured his girlfriend to break up with him, and once it happened, he realized, I have a life now. And it actually was good for him. So there's these outside pressures of schools and people in schools and breakups, even the victim seeing it's actually beneficial, and this proves this idea and how it's a link and doesn't prove anything and is actually false. Let's go down to contention 3 now, where they said no proof. They said it's out of a relationship is out of place. I have 3 responses to this. My first response is a worldview determines. The worldview determines. This kind of comes into play in this issue of culture, and when it does come into play is my second response is celebrity idolization. Celebrity idolization. A lot of times when the culture influences in the songs and TV shows is when we idolize what celebrities say, what they do. If we take this, I know we're not supposed to bring our own beliefs into play here, but ultimately from a Christian standpoint, when you view a relationship and the issues like this, it could determine how the culture actually affects it. My third response is it's not always true. It's not always true. Talking about the culture and the influence now, don't hate on me for it, but I'm a huge country music fan. I know a lot of people don't like country music, but one example of this is a song by Old Dominion in which he says, I know you ain't in love with him, break up with him. It's one of these songs of telling someone to break up. Culture doesn't always influence you one way or the other. It doesn't prove this idea of can they cope or not. Now that we've dealt with those arguments, I'd just like to point out for you that contention 1 and contention 2, there wasn't really any direct refutation. I'd just like to re-emphasize this. What contention 1 was the part to whole fallacy. Basically, it goes back to the burdens that they have to prove it true in every instance. And what the government team has done, while they have great examples about his cousin and other examples of this, they've taken a couple of examples examples and saying this is true across the board. That's the part, the whole fallacy, that there's a really technical Latin term for it that I cannot remember, but it's basically you're taking part and making that true for the whole, which is why it's a fallacy. It's not true. Let's go down to the second contention about influence versus reality. Again, the contention one about hormones, the outside sources, and of culture and a feeling of security all are influences. They're all things that could affect it, but they don't actually prove that teenagers aren't coping right now and that every teenager isn't. With that in mind, I just have two other contentions that I'd like to put on the flow for you from the opposition team. Contention 3 you can write down is the person who called it off. The person who called it off. Again, this is going back to the idea of, are we debating victims or all teenagers? And again, all teenagers. It's pretty much straightforward, is that their definition of teenagers cannot cope with a breakup. The person who called it off obviously has a reason for it and isn't going to go into some emotional disaster because of it. This also proves their interpretation of the resolution wrong. But contention 4 you can write down is that of no proof of no coping. No proof of no coping. Now, we've said this a lot throughout the round, but I wanted to get it in a contention for the opposition team, basically to emphasize the issue that even if you agree with all of their contentions, it does need, none of them prove that teenagers aren't coping, that they aren't doing it now, and that it's not true. These are all influences on what could change it. Our hormones, rather unstable, outside sources, culture, and a feeling of security are all influences that could make us be unstable if we broke up. We have a couple examples of it, but again, it doesn't prove the statement that we literally can't even cope. So for these reasons, please cite off.
Well, it seems like this has been a really intimate debate round. We got to know all kinds of things about everyone's love lives, a little blackmail material here, maybe? No, just kidding. But what I'm going to talk about today is my voting issues. Hopefully these won't be awkward, they'll just be fun. And I'll have 5 voting issues to prove to you why the opposition team should win today's debate round. My first voting issue you can tag as all cases burden failed. Again, all cases burden failed. And what I'm referring to is the burden that we put on them in that all cases, the resolution must be proven true. They've given you some good reasons to think that some teenagers can't cope, and we agree, that's absolutely true. But the problem is, the inherent flaw within their interpretation of the resolution is that it requires that in all cases, this be proven true, and that simply hasn't been proven true, and there's no way to prove it true. So the government team has kind of put themselves in a bind here, but that's what the reality is. My second voting issue you can tag as must look to all teens. Must look to all teens. In the third government speech, Nathan started trying to limit the resolution to only the victims, but I would remind you that in the very first speech, they did define it as teenagers, not the victims, but all teenagers. My partner brought that up again, that if we're talking about all teenagers, then immediately it's proven untrue that the resolution that teenagers can't cope is true all the time, because the break-upper can absolutely cope. Maybe the breakup-ee is going to be crying on their bed listening to Ed Sheeran while eating ice cream, but the person who did the deed is absolutely going to be able to cope. And they're a teenager too, and they broke up with someone, but they coped. My third voting issue you can tag as outside pressures don't prove the resolution. Again, outside pressures don't prove the res. The outside pressures talked about in contention 2 and also in contention 3 about culture and how school and friends and songs and TV shows are all telling us we should get in relationships, and that it's really sad when we don't have a relationship. Those pressures may exist, but again, it doesn't serve to do anything really for the government team. It doesn't prove that in all instances teenagers can't cope. My fourth voting issue you can tag as recognize the fallacy. Again, recognize the fallacy. It's very important that we recognize the fallacy, the part to whole fallacy here, because that's essentially what the government team is writing on for their case. They're saying that because sometimes teenagers can't cope, therefore all the time it's true. But as my partner and I pointed out, this is a logical fallacy with a fancy Latin name that we seem to have forgotten, but this fallacy does prove that just because sometimes something happens, you can't apply that to every single case. And my fifth and final voting issue you can tag as even breakups can be positive. Even breakups can be positive. A little ironic that my partner and I both happen to have examples of that, but for both of us in our breakups, they were positive in both instances. people can mutually agree that they're just not good for each other, and they can say, it's not you, it's me, and go their separate ways. They can smile the next day, they can live their life, and they can move on. The issue with the resolution today is it's just simply too broad to be proven by the government team that in every instance a teenager can't cope. They brought up the contentions of feelings of security, mentally unstable, outside pressures and culture. But as I talked about, and I'd just like to remind you, sometimes breakups can make teenagers more mentally stable because they're not caught in a relationship they don't want to be in. They don't feel that pressure anymore. Or it can make them more secure because they're not in an abusive relationship, or they realize that they're better on their own. At the end of the day, none of the contentions support the government team. Well, if you flowed my voting issues with the exact wording, which doesn't always happen, but hopefully it spells amore. Thank you. I was considering doing love, but I thought maybe we should be more sophisticated and do it in Italian and French, which would be amore. So we have all kinds of languages in today's debate round, I guess, which gets rid of the standard of only white girls, because now we're talking about more cultures. But to end this speech, I'm very glad that you recognize the voting issue spelled amore, and for all of those reasons, I would strongly urge an opposition ballot, because Caleb and I could even. Thank you.
Ready? Back when I was 16, all of my friends said, Jake, why don't you have a girlfriend? I mean, you're handsome, why don't you have a girlfriend? Is it because you're homeschooled? And I responded with, probably. Now, my mom has had a lot of influence on my life, and some influence on my love life too. And she has been very protective and very good at keeping me safe from bad relationships, so I haven't had to go through the negative effects of going through a breakup. But really what I want to focus on today is why teenagers simply cannot cope with a breakup. And really what I want to do is talk about how really teenagers cannot cope with a relationship. I want to go through the voting issues that were brought up, since they really address all of the points that were brought up by the opposition team. And I want to address each of those voting issues and respond to them, and then bring up a voting issue of my own. So their first voting issue was all cases burden failed, basically saying that we have to prove that in all cases teenagers cannot cope. Now throughout the round, people have been saying, well, they can't cope because, or they can cope because there are people who feel good after breaking up, but that doesn't mean that they're coping with the breakup. That just means that they feel good for doing something terrible. It doesn't mean that they go back and talk to the person who they broke up with. Coping with a relationship is being able to go back to how you were, being able to go back to how you were before the relationship, and then being able to say, we have gone back to a point to where we started from. That's coping with the relationship. That's not ignoring the other person and then going off and feeling good about having ruined someone's life. There's completely different things that should have been talked about. That's really what we're talking about. I have a friend who was in a relationship for 2 years. Now, after those 2 years, he broke up with his girlfriend. Since then, he has not talked to her for over a year. That's a long time. That's not coping with the relationship. That's just ignoring the problem. That's not coping with the relationship. Teenagers simply don't know how to cope with breaking up from a relationship. But their next voting issue was must look to all teens. Again, teenagers can't cope. Yes, they can ignore the problem, but they can't cope with the problem. They can't go to the problem and say, I'm going to try and fix this problem. The next voting issue was that of outside pressures don't prove resolution. Now, we weren't saying that all of these examples of outside pressures prove that teenagers can't cope. But what we were saying is that these outside pressures make coping much harder. That's why we brought up these examples, is because it makes teenagers feel out of place when they're out of a relationship. If I don't have a girlfriend, then all of a sudden society says you're doing something wrong. You should have a girlfriend because you're a teenage guy. You should go out and have a girlfriend because that's what we as society think. That's how society defines what a teenager should do, and it makes coping with the breakup much harder because now you're out of place according to society. Their next voting issue was that of recognize the fallacy. They were basically saying that this is a part to whole fallacy, that we're saying that all teenagers can't cope because we're looking at a couple of key examples, or a few different examples that we brought up. But again, I'd like to point out that teenagers can't cope. They can ignore the problem all they want, but they can't cope with the actual problem. And then down to their final voting issue of even breakups can be positive. I agree, even breakups can be positive. Sometimes it's a good thing to get out of a bad relationship. but that doesn't mean you're coping with the problem. That's the main issue here, is that teenagers can ignore the problem all they want, but they aren't coping with the problem. Now let's go to my one voting issue of unstable life stage. Again, unstable life stage. We're really going to be talking about why teenagers are in a bad situation when they're breaking up as a teenager. Now, as teenagers, we're going through a lot of different changes, going from being a kid to being an adult. Now, we're going through all kinds of different things that we've never experienced before, relationships being one big factor. We're going through serious relationships, and when someone breaks up in a relationship, when they get out of that relationship, that can be very shocking to them, very harmful, because they've never experienced that before. Now, subpoint A, you can tag as more influenced by others. As teenagers, many teenagers, not all, like I was saying, but many teenagers are rebellious against their parents. They go off and listen to other people. They listen to anyone but their closest peers. They listen to people such as some of the friends that they have at school. They listen to society, but they don't listen to their parents. They're more influenced by people who haven't been around them their entire lives. Subpoint B is out of relationship, out of place. Again, out of relationship, out of place. That's how many teenagers view relationships. They say, if I'm not in a relationship, I'm out of place, because that's what society says. It says that if I don't have a girlfriend or I don't have a boyfriend, then I am suddenly out of place. I don't belong with the rest of society. And subpoint C, or the impact of this, is teenagers can't cope. They can ignore the problem all they want. But really, when we look at the problem, we have to see that teenagers simply don't know how to cope with the problem of a breakup, and that's why I urge you to side with the government team by siding with the resolution today. Thank you.